Footsteps on marble at 3 in the morning usually meant a breach. Vincent drew his Glock before he even cleared the staircase. But the intruder wasn't a hitman. It was Charmian, his new maid, scrubbing a single porcelain plate until her knuckles bled. He watched from the shadows, noticing the purpled cheek she desperately tried to hide. He knew she hadn't been to class in 3 days. By sunrise, Vincent would find out exactly who dared touch what belonged to him. Silence in the Costa estate was a rare and heavy thing. It was a sprawling, fortified compound in the hills, built on decades of racketeering and blood money, usually humming with the low static of earpieces, the crunch of gravel under tires, or the muffled thud of a basement door closing. But at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, the house was dead. Vincent Costa was not. Sleep was a luxury his brain rarely afforded him. He sat in the dark of his bedroom, a glass of amber liquid sweating onto a leather coaster. Listening. He knew the sounds of his home the way a mechanic knows an engine. The wind against the reinforced glass, the hum of the central air, then a scrape. It was faint. It came from the west wing, down on the ground floor. The kitchens. Vincent didn't bother with a shirt. He grabbed the Glock 19 from the nightstand. His bare feet made no sound against the imported hardwood as he slipped into the hallway. He moved with the fluid, practiced efficiency of a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts before his 30th birthday. Down the sweeping staircase, keeping his back to the wall, scanning the negative space in the darkness, he approached the arched entryway of the main kitchen. The massive room was a chef's sterile fantasy of stainless steel and white marble. The overhead lights were off, but the golden glow from the range hood cast a pool of illumination over the massive farmhouse sink. Someone was standing there. Vincent lowered the barrel of the gun just a fraction, stepping into the doorway. It was Charmian. She was one of the new hires, brought in by the housekeeper a month ago. 19, quiet, unremarkable in the grey uniform standard for the estate staff. She was supposed to work weekends and Tuesday afternoons, paying her way through some local community college. She wasn't supposed to be here at 3 a.m. Vincent stayed in the shadows, his finger slipping off the trigger guard. He watched her. Charmian was scrubbing a heavy frying pan. She wasn't just washing it, she was attacking it. Her shoulders hitched with every frantic, violent rotation of the sponge. The water running from the faucet was scalding. Steam billowed up, curling around her face and dampening the loose strands of brown hair that had escaped her messy bun. She wasn't wearing her uniform. She wore an oversized, faded grey hoodie and a pair of worn denim jeans. Vincent's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, his footfall intentionally heavy. Charmian gasped, dropping the pan. It hit the stainless steel sink with a deafening clatter. She spun around, her back pressing hard against the counter, chest heaving. Her eyes darted wildly, terrified, before locking onto Vincent. "Mr. Costa," she breathed, her voice cracking. Vincent didn't say anything at first. He stepped fully into the dim light, sliding the Glock into the waistband of his sweatpants. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since she'd been hired. She was shaking. Not just a nervous tremble, but a deep, bone-rattling shudder. Her left cheekbone was swollen, a mottled canvas of yellow and deep plum. Her lower lip was split, dried crimson crusted in the corner of her mouth. But it was her hands that caught his attention. She held them awkwardly in front of her stomach, defensive. The knuckles on her right hand were split and raw, bleeding sluggishly into the soapy water dripping from her fingers. "You're making a mess," Vincent said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that offered zero comfort. Charmian flinched. She quickly wiped her wet, bloody hands on the front of her hoodie, leaving a dark, wet stain. I'm sorry, sir. I was just cleaning up." at 3 in the morning. I couldn't sleep. Neither could I, Vincent said, walking slowly towards the kitchen island. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to smell the harsh dish soap and the faint, metallic scent of copper. But I don't scrub cast iron until my hands bleed. Charmian dropped her gaze to the floor. I wanted to get ahead on tomorrow's chores. Mrs. Gable said the kitchen needed a deep clean. It was a lie. A bad one. Vincent had built an empire on reading lies. He saw the way her jaw tightened, the way her eyes darted to the side door that led to the staff quarters. "Look at me," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Charmian hesitated, then slowly raised her head. The light from the range hood caught the swelling around her eye. Up close, she looked younger, smaller, but there was a hard, stubborn glint in her brown eyes. She was scared of him, yes, but she was used to being scared. He could tell. "Who hit you?" Vincent asked. Charmian swallowed hard. "Nobody. I fell." "You fell?" "Yes." "On your face?" "Yes." "And your knuckles, did they fall too?" Charmian crossed her arms over her chest, hugging herself. "I was carrying groceries. I tripped on the curb outside my apartment." "It's nothing, Mr. Costa. I promise it won't affect my work." Vincent stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He wasn't a bleeding heart. He ran a syndicate that controlled the docks, the unions, and half the narcotics traffic in the state. People got hit every day. People bled every day. It wasn't his problem, but Charmian was in his house. She was standing in his kitchen, bleeding into his sink, lying to his face. He didn't like disorder, and he hated when things that belonged to him, even the staff on his payroll, were damaged by outside forces. "Go to the bathroom down the hall," Vincent said, his tone flat. "Clean your face, bandage your hands. If I see you scrubbing another pan tonight, you're fired." Charmian blinked, surprised by the abrupt dismissal. "Yes, sir. Thank you." She slipped past him, giving him a wide berth. Vincent turned and watched her walk away. She favored her left leg, a subtle limp that she tried to hide. When the hallway door clicked shut, Vincent walked over to the sink. He reached into the hot water and pulled out a sodden piece of fabric she had shoved down toward the drain. It was a light blue polo shirt. The uniform for St. Jude's College, the school she attended. It was soaked in water and dish soap, but the dark, rusty stains covering the collar and chest were unmistakable. Blood, and a lot of it. Vincent let the shirt drop back into the sink. He turned off the faucet. He stood in the quiet kitchen for a long time, the silence returning, heavy and thick. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the sun was cutting harsh angles through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vincent's home office. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, the jacket draped over the back of his leather chair. A single cup of black coffee sat untouched on his desk. The door opened without a knock. Alejandro White walked in. Alejandro was Vincent's underboss, a man who looked like an accountant and fought like a rabid dog. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, a perfectly tailored navy suit, and carried a manila folder. "Morning, boss," Alejandro said, dropping the folder on the polished mahogany desk. "Got what you asked for?" Vincent didn't look at the folder. He looked at Alejandro. "And Charmian Flannery, 19, raised in foster care after her mother OD'd. No father on record. She aged out of the system a year ago. Rents a shoebox apartment on the south side. Works here 3 days a week. Works at a diner on 4th Street the other 4. Enrolled at St. Jude's. Business major. Straight A's." Alejandro paused, pulling off his glasses and wiping them with a microfiber cloth from his pocket. Or she was. Vincent's jaw tightened. "Explain." "She hasn't been to class in 3 days," Alejandro said. sliding a printed attendance sheet across the desk. Missed a midterm yesterday. Her professors haven't heard from her. The diner manager says she called out sick on Sunday and Monday. Where was she? Working, Alejandro replied, his voice dropping a register. Just not for the diner. Vincent leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. Stop playing games, Alejandro. Give it to me straight. Alejandro sighed, putting his glasses back on. She has a brother, Tommy Flannery, older by 4 years. The kid is a degenerate gambler and a low-level tweaker. He ran up a 40 grand debt with the Petrov crew. The Petrovs, a mid-tier Russian outfit that ran illegal card games and loan sharking out of the industrial district. They paid a heavy tax to the Costa family to operate. They were bottom feeders, but they were vicious. Tommy bolted, Alejandro continued. Left town 2 weeks ago. The Petrovs couldn't find him, so they went looking for the next of kin. They found Charmian on campus last Friday. Vincent felt a cold, jagged knot pull tight in his stomach. The image of Charmian in the kitchen, trembling, scrubbing blood out of her school uniform, flashed in his mind. They grabbed her, Vincent asked, his voice dangerously soft. Cornered her in a parking garage, Alejandro said. According to a camera feed my guys pulled from the university. 3 of Petrov's goons had a nice long chat with her. Rough stuff. Pushed her around, but they didn't kill her. Dead girls can't pay off debts. How is she paying them? She's cleaning out stash houses, running cash drops, working the floor at their underground clubs after hours. They're working her to the bone, adding ridiculous interest every day. She missed school because they had her scrubbing blood out of a warehouse in the Port District after a deal went bad. Vincent picked up his coffee mug. It was cold. He set it back down. The anger that coursed through him wasn't hot and fiery. It was absolute zero. It was a precise, calculated rage. The Petrovs operated in his city by his grace. They paid him for the privilege of breathing, and yet they had the audacity to lay hands on someone who worked under his roof. They took a girl who was pulling herself out of the gutter, going to school, working 2 jobs, and they dragged her into the mud to pay for a coward's mistakes. They put hands on her, Vincent stated. It wasn't a question. The bruises on her face. Alejandro nodded. That was Anton, Petrov's nephew. He has a heavy hand and a bad temper. Vincent stood up. He walked over to the humidor on the bookshelf, selected a cigar, and clipped the end. He didn't light it. He just rolled it between his fingers, staring out the window at the sprawling green lawns of his estate. What do you want to do, Vince? Alejandro asked quietly. She's just a maid. We fire her, hand her her final paycheck and wash our hands of it. Let the Russians have her. It's not our mess. Vincent turned around. The look in his dark eyes made Alejandro take a subtle half-step back. She's on my payroll, Vincent said, his voice echoing in the large room. She eats in my kitchen. She walks in my halls. That makes her mine to protect. Nobody bleeds in my house unless I put the hole in them. Alejandro nodded slowly. Understood. I'll get a crew together. We'll pay Petrov a visit. No, Vincent said, dropping the unlit cigar into a heavy glass ashtray. We don't go to them. Not yet. I want her in here. Now. Alejandro hesitated. She's in the middle of a shift. Mopping the East Wing, I think. I don't care if she's performing open-heart surgery. Bring her to me. Charmian stood in the center of the Persian rug, clutching a yellow microfiber cloth in her hands, like a lifeline. She was back in her standard grey uniform. The swelling on her cheek had darkened to a vicious shade of violet, and a fresh white bandage was wrapped clumsily around her right hand. She stared at the floor, terrified. She had been summoned to the boss's office. You only got summoned to Vincent Costa's office if you were stealing or if you were dead. She hadn't stolen anything. which left only one option. Vincent sat behind his massive desk, watching her. He let the silence stretch. He wanted her off balance, but as he watched her wring the cloth in her hands, he felt a strange, unwelcome prick of empathy. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to one of the leather wingback chairs opposite him. Charmian jumped slightly at the sound of his voice. "I prefer to stand, sir. My uniform is dusty. I don't want to—" "Sit down, Charmian." She swallowed hard and moved to the edge of the chair, perching rigidly. "You missed your midterm yesterday," Vincent said. Charmian's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "Macroeconomics, wasn't it?" Vincent continued, flipping casually through the manila folder on his desk. "Professor Higgins, you've held a solid 4.0 GPA until now. It's a shame to throw it away." How do you know that?" she whispered, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the armrests. "I know everything that happens in my city." Vincent leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Just like I know your brother Tommy is a junkie coward who skipped town on a $40,000 debt." Charmian physically recoiled. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and fragile beneath the bruising. She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion. "No, no, please. Mr. Costa, I swear to God, I won't bring trouble here. They don't know I work for you. I made sure they don't know." "They?" Vincent raised an eyebrow. "You mean the Petrovs?" Charmian squeezed her eyes shut. A single tear slipped free, cutting a path through the faint layer of dust on her cheek. "I'm handling it," she said, her voice shaking violently. "I just need a few more weeks. I'm working it off." "You're making minimum wage scrubbing toilets and washing dishes, Charmian, and whatever loose change they throw at you for cleaning up their blood. You'll be working it off until you're dead." "I don't have a choice," she snapped, her eyes snapping open. The sudden fire in her gaze surprised him. It wasn't just fear, it was desperate anger. "He's my brother. I'm all he has. If I don't pay it, they'll find him and kill him. And if I stop working for them, they'll kill me." Vincent stared at her. She was a kid carrying the weight of a degenerate's sins, completely alone in a world of wolves. "And Anton?" Vincent asked, keeping his voice dangerously even. "Did he give you that bruise to motivate you?" Charmian looked away, her jaw trembling. "I dropped a tray of glasses at their club. He got mad. It was an accident." "An accident?" Vincent stood up. He walked slowly around the desk. Charmian tensed, pressing herself deeper into the leather chair, expecting a blow. Instead, Vincent leaned back against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms, looking down at her. "You're not going back there," he said. Charmian looked up, panicked. "You don't understand. If I don't show up tonight for the cash run, they'll come for me. You have to let me go. Please fire me if you have to, but don't stop me from paying them." "I'm not firing you," Vincent said flatly. "And you're not paying them another dime." "But they won't do a damn thing," Vincent interrupted, his voice laced with absolute, chilling authority. "Because they operate in my city, they breathe my air, and you work for me." Charmian stared at him, trying to comprehend what he was saying. Why are you doing this? I'm just a maid." Vincent looked down at her bruised face, at the bandage on her hand. He thought of the bloody school uniform in his sink. He didn't have a good answer for her. He could tell her it was about pride, about territory, about principle. But looking at her, he knew it was something else, something he wasn't ready to examine. "Because I hate a mess," Vincent said coldly. "And you, Charmian, are making a mess in my house." He pushed off the desk and walked toward the door. "Go back to the kitchen. Have the chef make you something to eat. You look like a stiff breeze would knock you over." "Where are you going?" Charmian asked, her voice small. Vincent paused with his hand on the brass doorknob. He looked back at her, his dark eyes devoid of any mercy. "I'm going to have a chat with Anton Petrov about his temper." Rain slickened the cobblestones of the industrial district by the time Vincent's motorcade rolled to a stop. 3 black SUVs idled in the narrow alleyway behind the brass ring, blocking the only exit. Alejandro killed the engine of the lead car. The rhythmic hum of the windshield wipers was the only sound for a long moment. Vincent stepped out into the drizzle. He wore no overcoat, just the tailored charcoal suit from his office, the fabric pulling taut across his shoulders as he adjusted his cuffs. The damp cold felt good. It kept him sharp. He walked toward the heavy steel service door, flanked by Alejandro and 2 men from his personal detail. Neither of the enforcers carried their weapons openly, but the heavy drape of their jackets spoke volumes. Alejandro didn't knock. He bypassed the keypad, produced a heavy tungsten pry bar from inside his coat, and wedged it into the electronic maglock. A sharp, violent wrench downward, and the steel door popped open with a metallic groan. Inside, the club smelled like stale beer, ozone, and cheap pine cleaner. It was barely noon. The underground casino wouldn't open to its degenerate clientele for another 8 hours. Fluorescent service lights bathed the room in a harsh, sterile glare, exposing the sticky, scuffed hardwood floors and the tacky, crushed velvet booths lining the walls. Anton Petrov sat in a central booth, counting bricks of $20 bills. He was a massive, heavily muscled man in his late 20s, with a shaved head and knuckles covered in faded Cyrillic prison ink. 2 other Russian heavies were leaning against the mahogany bar, smoking cheap cigarettes and watching a daytime sports broadcast on a muted television. The heavy thud of the steel door closing behind Vincent's crew made everyone freeze. The 2 men at the bar reached inside their leather jackets. "I wouldn't," Alejandro said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a scalpel. He didn't draw a weapon, merely let his suit jacket fall open to reveal the shoulder holster holding his Sig Sauer. The enforcers behind him mirrored the stance. Anton slowly lowered a stack of cash to the table. His pale eyes darted from Alejandro to Vincent, processing the sudden shift in gravity within his club. A nervous, oily sheen broke out on his forehead. He knew exactly who Vincent Costa was. Everyone who breathed in this city knew. "Mr. Costa," Anton said, his thick accent making the words sound like gravel being ground underfoot. He didn't stand up. Standing up would be an admission of fear. "To what do I owe the honor? Uncle Yuri handles our tribute on the 1st of the month. It is only the 12th. Vincent walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the empty cavern of the club. He didn't stop until he was standing directly over Anton's booths. He looked down at the younger man with the detached, analytical gaze of a butcher inspecting a slab of meat. "Tommy Flannery," Vincent said. It wasn't a question. Anton blinked, clearly thrown off balance. Of all the things he expected the head of the Costa syndicate to bring down upon him, a low-level junkie's gambling debt wasn't one of them. He forced a dry chuckle, leaning back against the velvet cushions. "Flannery, the tweaker who ran out on 40 grand. Anton waved a massive hand dismissively. "That is garbage business, Mr. Costa. Small time. We are handling it. His little sister is working it off. Good worker, actually. Never complains. She missed her midterm yesterday," Vincent said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. Anton stared at him, bewildered. "What?" "She goes to St. Jude's. She's a business major. She missed her macroeconomics midterm because you had her scrubbing blood out of a warehouse floor." A heavy, suffocating tension settled over the room. The 2 Russians at the bar exchanged uneasy glances, slowly raising their hands to rest on the counter, making sure Alejandro could see their empty palms. They were starting to realize that the air in the room had turned toxic, even if Anton was too stupid to smell it. I don't understand, Anton stammered, his arrogant facade cracking. She is a rat paying off a debt. What does her schooling have to do with the Coaster family? She is on my payroll, Vincent said softly. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on the table, bringing his face inches from Anton's. She is my maid. She cleans my home, and yesterday she bled in my sink. Anton swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. We didn't know. I swear to God, Mr. Costa. We just pulled the file on next of kin. If we knew she belonged to your house, we never would have touched her. But you did touch her. Vincent's gaze dropped to Anton's hands. Which hand, Anton? Mr. Costa, please. Which hand? The command whipped through the air, sharp and absolute. Anton trembled. Slowly, terrified, he lifted his right hand, the knuckles scarred and thick with callus. She dropped a tray. Cost us $200 in top-shelf liquor. I just cuffed her to teach her a lesson. Vincent nodded slowly, straightening up. Alejandro stepped forward, reaching into his pocket. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound checkbook and a silver fountain pen. He quickly scrawled a figure, tore the check free, and placed it on the table next to the stacks of dirty 20s. Anton looked down. The check was made out for $40,000. The debt is settled, Vincent said. Tommy Flannery's ledger is wiped clean. You don't look for him. You don't ask about him. And if you ever speak his sister's name again, I will have Alejandro cut out your tongue and feed it to the stray dogs behind your uncle's meatpacking plant. Are we clear? Relief washed over Anton's face in a visible wave. He had expected a bullet. Instead, he got paid. He grinned, a greedy, ugly expression. Clear, Mr. Costa. Absolutely clear. We are businessmen. The debt is paid. The girl is yours. Anton reached out with his right hand to pick up the check. Vincent moved with terrifying speed. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply reached out, his hand clamping down on Anton's thick wrist like an industrial vice. Before Anton could react, Vincent twisted the arm violently, pinning the Russian's hand flat against the heavy oak table. Anton yelled in surprise, trying to pull back, but Vincent's grip was immovable. With his free hand, Vincent picked up the heavy, solid brass ashtray resting in the center of the table. He didn't hesitate. He didn't blink. He brought the brass down with a sickening, wet crunch directly onto the back of Anton's pinned hand. Anton screamed. It was a high, tearing sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Vincent lifted the ashtray and brought it down again. Harder, bones shattered, cartilage popped, blood sprayed across the scattered $20 bills and stained the leather checkbook. The two men at the bar twitched, but Alejandro's gun was suddenly out, leveled squarely at the bartender's chest. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, except for Anton, who was sobbing hysterically, his ruined hand a mangled, bleeding mess on the wood. Vincent calmly set the bloody ashtray aside. He pulled a pristine white linen handkerchief from his pocket and carefully wiped his own hands. The check settles the brother's debt, Vincent said quietly, dropping the soiled handkerchief onto Anton's lap. That settles yours. Vincent turned his back on the weeping man and walked toward the exit. He didn't look back as he pushed out into the cold, damp alleyway. Alejandro followed a second later, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind them, sealing the screams inside. Porcelain clinked gently against glass. The sound was small, fragile, and utterly out of place in the cavernous, formal dining room of the Costa estate. Vincent sat at the head of a massive mahogany table that could comfortably seat 20. Tonight, it seated only him. The crystal chandelier overhead cast a warm, amber glow over the room, but the shadows in the corners felt heavier than usual. A plate of roasted lamb and root vegetables sat untouched in front of him. His appetite had vanished somewhere between the first and second strike of the brass ashtray. The swinging doors leading to the kitchen pushed open. Charmian walked in. She shouldn't have been there. Her shift ended at 6. It was past 9. But she moved with a quiet, terrified purpose, carrying a silver pitcher of ice water. She still wore her grey uniform, the fabric hanging loosely off her slight frame. The bandage on her hand had been changed, stark white against her pale skin, and the bruising on her cheek had settled into an ugly, deep purple. Vincent watched her approach in silence. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she reached out to fill his water glass. The ice clattered noisily against the crystal rim. She was trying desperately to keep her composure, but he could see the frayed edges of her panic. She looked like a bird trapped in a room with a closing door. "You're off the clock, Charmian," Vincent said, his voice low, lacking its usual commanding edge. Charmian stopped pouring. She set the heavy pitcher down on the table, clutching her hands in front of her apron. "Mrs. Gable said you hadn't eaten. I wanted to make sure you had water." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. She was hovering. She was waiting for the axe to fall. In the world she had been dragged into, nobody did a favor without demanding payment in blood, sweat, or worse. Vincent reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and tossed it onto the polished mahogany. It slid smoothly across the table, stopping inches from Charmian's hands. Charmian looked down. It was a photocopy of a ledger page. Written in crude, blocky Russian script were various names and numbers. At the very bottom, highlighted in yellow, was T. Flannery, 40,000. Drawn aggressively through them was a thick, black line, and next to it, stamped in red ink, was the word paid. Charmian stared at the paper. She didn't touch it. She looked at it as if it might detonate. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the air conditioning. "It's over," Vincent said, leaning back in his chair. He picked up his glass of bourbon, the ice clinking softly. "The Petrovs consider the debt settled. Your brother is no longer a target, and neither are you. You don't go back to their clubs. You don't clean their stash houses." Charmian's eyes remained glued to the paper. Her breathing hitched, shallow and rapid. "You paid them." "I bought the debt." "Yes." She finally looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, wide pools of brown swimming in absolute terror. This wasn't the relief he had expected. This was pure, unadulterated dread. $40,000, she said, the words choking her. She stumbled back a half step, her hand flying to her chest. "Mr. Costa, I don't have that. I make $16 an hour. I can't pay you back. I don't know what you want from me, but I can't do whatever they do. I won't." Vincent frowned, a subtle tightening of his jaw. He realized exactly what she was thinking. The Petrovs owned her because of the debt, and now she believed Vincent Costa, a man vastly more dangerous than any Russian street thug, owned her instead. She thought she had just traded a cage of iron for a cage of steel. "Sit down," Vincent commanded. Charmian froze, shaking her head. "Please, sir, I'll work double shifts. I'll drop out of school and clean this house every day, but please don't make me—" "Charmian, sit." He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute authority in his tone gave her no choice. Slowly, trembling like a leaf in a winter storm, she pulled out the heavy oak chair to his right and sat on the very edge of the cushion. She kept her eyes on her lap, waiting for her sentence. Vincent placed his glass down. He looked at her battered face, the exhaustion etched deep into the lines around her eyes. She was 19 years old, carrying the weight of a world designed to crush her. "Look at me," he said softly. She forced her head up. A single tear escaped, tracking down the unbruised side of her face. "I didn't buy your debt as an investment," Vincent said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He spoke, making sure every word registered. "I didn't do it to leverage you. You are a maid in my house. You do a good job. You keep the kitchen clean. You don't steal. I require my staff to be functional." Charmian stared at him, trying to pass the cold logic. "Functional? You can't scrub my floors if your hands are broken," Vincent stated, pointing briefly at her bandaged knuckles. "And you can't study for your midterms if you're bleaching blood out of concrete for low-level thugs. So, the problem has been removed. The debt is gone, erased. It doesn't transfer to me." Charmian's lips parted in shock. You're just letting it go? $40,000? To her, it was a staggering, insurmountable fortune. To him, it was a rounding error in a week's bookkeeping. "I consider it an advance on your salary," Vincent lied smoothly. He didn't want her gratitude, and he certainly didn't want her awe. He needed her to feel safe, but he had to wrap it in the transactional language they both understood. "You will continue to work your scheduled shifts, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and weekends. You will go back to your classes. You will graduate, and you will never speak to a Petrov again. Is that understood?" Charmian opened her mouth, but the words bottlenecked in her throat. The sheer weight of what he was telling her, that she was free, that her brother wasn't going to end up in a ditch, that she didn't have to look over her shoulder every time she left her apartment, finally crashed into her. She let out a harsh, broken sob. She immediately slapped both hands over her mouth, mortified, trying to muffle the sound. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking violently as months of repressed terror and exhaustion finally boiled over. Vincent sat perfectly still. He was a man accustomed to violence, to betrayal, to the cold mechanics of power. He was not accustomed to a 19-year-old girl weeping in his dining room because he had shown her a sliver of mercy. It made his chest feel tight, an unfamiliar and wholly unwelcome sensation. He didn't offer her a platitude. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He reached out, grabbed a pristine white linen napkin from the table, and slid it toward her. Charmian took it with shaking hands, pressing it against her eyes. "I'm sorry," she gasped, her voice thick. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Costa. I'm being unprofessional." "You're breathing, Charmian," Vincent said quietly. "For the first time in weeks, by the look of it. Take a minute." He picked up his bourbon and took a slow sip, looking out the dark windows toward the perimeter wall. He had eliminated the threat. The ledger was clear. The house was orderly once more, but as he listened to the quiet, stuttering breaths of the girl sitting next to him, Vincent realized the problem wasn't solved. It had just changed shape. He had stepped out of the shadows to protect something he didn't own, and in doing so, he had tied a thread between them. A thread that, in his world, could easily become a noose. November stripped the oak trees bare along the perimeter of the Costa estate, leaving the sprawling grounds looking skeletal and severe. Inside the house, a quiet, fragile rhythm had taken root. Charmian returned to her classes. She worked her shifts. Slowly, the violent violet on her cheek faded to a sickly yellow, then vanished into the pale landscape of her skin. The heavy white bandages on her knuckles were replaced by small adhesive strips, and eventually just raw pink scars. The most noticeable change, however, wasn't physical. It was the way she occupied space. The defensive, cowering hunch disappeared from her shoulders. She stopped flinching when a door slammed, She stopped looking at the kitchen knives like they were weapons of last resort. Vincent observed this transformation entirely from the periphery. He never sought her out. He never asked about her brother or the debt. He maintained the strict, unapproachable distance of an employer. But he noticed that she favored a specific brand of green tea from the pantry. He noticed she listened to classical piano on her phone while she polished the silver. He told himself he was merely monitoring an asset to ensure functionality. It was a comfortable lie. It unraveled slightly on a Tuesday night. Vincent had spent 6 hours in a windowless room at the docks, negotiating a union dispute that had threatened to cripple his outbound shipping lines. His head hammered with a dull, throbbing ache. He walked into the main kitchen at midnight, seeking ice and a glass of scotch. He stopped in the arched doorway. Charmian was sitting at the massive marble island. She was off the clock, wearing a faded grey sweatshirt and soft cotton pants. Her hair was piled into a chaotic knot, a pencil shoved haphazardly through the middle to hold it in place. A massive, heavy textbook was propped open in front of her, surrounded by a sea of loose-leaf paper covered in meticulous notes. A highlighter was clamped between her teeth as she aggressively tapped a calculator. Vincent walked in. His footsteps were heavy enough to announce his presence, deliberately avoiding a repeat of their first midnight encounter. Charmian jumped slightly, dropping the highlighter. She looked up, her eyes wide behind a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses he hadn't seen before. "Mr. Costa," she said, quickly standing up and wiping her hands on her sweatpants. "I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't be in here after hours. The Wi-Fi in the staff quarters is down, and I have a term paper due tomorrow. I can pack this up." "Sit down," Vincent said, walking past her to the commercial freezer. "I'm just getting ice." Charmian hovered awkwardly for a second before slowly lowering herself back onto the stool. She watched him retrieve a crystal tumbler and pour 2 fingers of expensive scotch over the ice. Vincent turned around, leaning against the counter. He took a sip, the amber liquid burning pleasantly down his throat. He looked at the sprawling mess of papers on the island. "Macroeconomics?" he asked. Charmian nodded, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Yes, we're covering market failures and asymmetric information." Vincent chuckled. It was a dry, humorless sound. A polite way of describing a rigged game. "The textbook argues it's an inefficiency," Charmian said, her voice small but steady. She tapped the glossy page. "When one party has more information than the other, the market collapses because trust evaporates. Akerlof's market for lemons theory." Vincent walked over to the island. He stood opposite her, looking down at the complex graphs charting supply, demand, and marginal cost. "The textbook assumes buyers and sellers are rational," Vincent said, his voice dropping into a low, conversational timbre. "It assumes they want a fair deal. That's a fantasy. Trust doesn't evaporate because of asymmetric information. Trust never exists in the first place. People aren't rational, Charmian. They are hungry, they are greedy, and they are scared. The market doesn't fail. It just shifts to benefit the guy holding the hammer." Charmian blinked, processing his words. She looked from the textbook up to his face. For the first time, she didn't look terrified. She looked intrigued. "But if the market is purely predatory, it isn't sustainable," she argued softly, a flicker of a debate student emerging. "If you squeeze the consumer too hard, they default. The system crashes. That's what happened in 2008. Greed overrode sustainability." "Sustainability is for farmers," Vincent replied, taking another sip of scotch. "In the real world, you don't need a system to last forever. You just need it to last long enough for you to cash out. And if it crashes, you buy the rubble for pennies on the dollar and build it again." He was speaking of his own world. The loan sharking, the extortion, the hostile takeovers of legitimate businesses. He watched her eyes narrow slightly as she connected the dots. She knew what he was, even if she didn't know the specifics. "That's a very cynical way to view the world," Charmian said quietly. "It's an accurate one." Vincent set his empty glass on the marble. He looked at her, truly looked at her, catching the reflection of the kitchen lights in her glasses. "Your brother took a loan he couldn't repay because he thought he could beat the system. The Petrovs bought his debt because they knew he would default, and they wanted the leverage. Everyone was operating on perfect information. The only one who didn't know the rules was you." Charmian looked down at her hands. The raw pink scars on her knuckles suddenly felt very prominent. "I know the rules now." "Do you?" "Yes." She looked up, her jaw set with a stubborn resolve that surprised him. "You don't play a game where the other guy is holding the hammer. You find a different game." Vincent stared at her for a long moment. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was gone before it fully formed. "Finish your paper, Charmian," he said, turning to leave the kitchen. "And get some sleep. You look exhausted." As he walked up the stairs in the dark, the throbbing in his head had faded. He realized with a deep, unsettling clarity that the 19-year-old maid washing his dishes was the sharpest person he had spoken to all week. Violence in the syndicate always carried an administrative cost. Every broken bone was a line item on a ledger. Yuri Petrov was an old-school brute who viewed his nephew's shattered hand as an unforgivable insult to his family name. He didn't care about the $40,000. He cared about respect, a commodity far more volatile than cash in the criminal ecosystem. Alejandro White dropped a thick file onto Vincent's desk the following Wednesday. Outside, a miserable grey rain lashed against the office windows. "Yuri is dragging his feet," Alejandro said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. 3 shipments of electronics were supposed to leave the port yesterday. They're sitting in a holding warehouse. The dockworkers' union, which Yuri heavily influences, is suddenly citing safety concerns and refusing to load the freighters. Vincent didn't look up from his laptop. "He's staging a strike." "He's testing the fence," Alejandro corrected. "He wants to see if you'll apologize for maiming Anton, or if you'll offer him a concession to get the boats moving. If we let this slide, the other capos will smell blood in the water. We look weak." Vincent closed his laptop with a sharp snap. He stood up, walking over to the window to watch the rain blur the manicured lawns. He had known this was coming. You couldn't shatter a man's hand with a brass ashtray and expect a thank you note. "Burn his secondary warehouse," Vincent said quietly. Alejandro paused. "The one in the meatpacking district? That's a major hub for their counterfeit goods. It'll cost them millions." "Exactly." Vincent turned around, his eyes cold and flat. "He wants to play games with my shipping lines over a bruised ego. Fine. I'll take $1 million bite out of his wallet. Do it tonight. Make sure the building is empty, but make sure it burns to the foundation." Alejandro nodded, scooping up the file. "Understood?" He hesitated at the door. "Vince, this is escalating quickly. Over a maid." "It's escalating over territory, Alejandro," Vincent corrected sharply. "Yuri thinks he can dictate terms in my city. Remind him he can't." While Vincent ordered fire in the hills, Charmian was dealing with the rain in the city. She stood under the concrete awning of the campus library, shivering in her thin coat. Her bus was 20 minutes late. She clutched a canvas tote bag tight to her chest, trying to protect her textbooks from the damp chill in the air. She was exhausted, running on 4 hours of sleep after a brutal accounting exam, but she felt lighter. The crushing, suffocating weight of the Petrov debt was gone. She was actually beginning to envision a future that didn't involve bleeding on concrete floors. "Charmian." The voice hit her like a physical blow. Her stomach dropped violently. She spun around. Standing near the edge of the brick pathway, soaked to the bone in a cheap, oversized trench coat, was Tommy. Her brother looked terrible. He was gaunt, his cheekbones jutting out sharply against pale, sallow skin. His eyes were frantic, darting around the courtyard, and his hands twitched constantly at his sides. He looked exactly like what he was, a junkie who had been on the run. "Tommy," she breathed, taking a panicked step back. "What are you doing here? If they see you—" "They ain't looking for me, Clary," Tommy interrupted, stepping out of the rain and under the awning. He smelled like stale cigarettes, unwashed clothes, and desperation. He offered a manic, jittery smile. "I heard. Word on the street is the Petrovs got paid out. The whole 40 grand, wiped clean." Charmian stared at him, a cold fury rising through her terror. "You heard. You ran away. You left me with them, Tommy. They cornered me. They beat me." Tommy winced, a brief flash of genuine guilt crossing his face, before the addiction hijacked his brain again. I know. I'm sorry, kid. I really am. I panicked. But it's fixed now, right? You found a way out. I always knew you were smart." He stepped closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Look, I need to know how you did it. Who paid it? Did you find a sugar daddy? Did you hit a number?" "You need to leave," Charmian said, her voice shaking with rage. "You need to walk away and never come near me again." "Come on, Clary, don't be like that," Tommy pleaded, reaching out and grabbing her forearm. His grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers digging into her coat. "I'm in a jam, a real bad one. I owe some guys in Trenton. Not a lot, just 3 grand. But they're breathing down my neck. If you got an in with somebody swinging that kind of weight, somebody who drops 40 grand like it's nothing, you can get me 3. Charmian struggled, trying to yank her arm free. "Let go of me. I don't have any money. I scrub toilets for a living because of you." "Stop lying," Tommy hissed, his desperation turning vicious. He yanked her closer. "Nobody pays off the Petrovs for a maid. You're holding out on me. Just get me the 3 grand, Charmian. I'm your brother." She said to let her go. The voice didn't belong to Tommy, and it certainly didn't belong to Charmian. Tommy froze. He slowly turned his head. Standing a few feet away, rain dripping off the brim of his flat cap, was Dominic. He was one of Vincent's drivers, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who usually spent his days polishing the fleet of SUVs. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore a dark, heavy peacoat, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He looked entirely unremarkable, except for the absolute deadness in his eyes. Vincent hadn't told Charmian she was being watched. He didn't want to make her feel like a prisoner. But he had ordered a tail on her the day he paid off Anton. He didn't trust the Russians to honor a deal, and he didn't trust the universe to leave her alone. "Who the hell are you?" Tommy sneered, though his grip on Charmian's arm loosened slightly. Dominic didn't answer. He simply pulled his right hand out of his pocket. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a heavy, black, telescoping baton. With a sharp flick of his wrist, the steel extended with a menacing clack. "I'm the guy who's going to break your knees if you don't take your hand off her," Dominic said casually. Tommy let go of Charmian as if she had caught fire. He stumbled back into the rain, his hands raised in surrender. He looked from Dominic to Charmian, betrayal and confusion warping his face. "You're running with heavy hitters now, Clary?" Tommy spat, backing away down the pathway. "Fine, but you owe me. You hear me? We're blood." He turned and bolted, disappearing into the grey downpour toward the street. Charmian stood frozen under the awning, trembling violently. She hugged her tote bag to her chest, her breathing jagged and shallow. Dominic collapsed the baton by driving the tip hard against the concrete wall. He slipped it back into his pocket and pulled a black umbrella from his other side. He opened it with a soft thump and walked over to her. "Mr. Costa's car is waiting at the curb, Miss Flannery," Dominic said politely, holding the umbrella over her head. "He suggested you might need a ride home in this weather." Charmian looked at the driver, then toward the street where a sleek black sedan was idling against the curb. She realized, with a terrifying finality, that Vincent Costa hadn't just bought her debt. He had built a fortress around her, and she had no idea how she was ever going to get out. Glass exploded inward. It didn't crack or splinter. It detonated, sending a shower of reinforced shards across the sterile white marble of the main kitchen. Charmian hit the floor before her brain fully registered the sound. Her knees slammed into the tile. The breath punched from her lungs as she scrambled instinctively behind the heavy oak island. A second later, the dull, rhythmic popping of suppressed gunfire chewed through the drywall where she had been standing seconds before. The estate's alarms shrieked, a high-pitched mechanical wail that vibrated in her teeth. Yuri Petrov had finally run out of patience. The burning of his warehouse was a financial hit, but the silence from the Costa syndicate was a public humiliation. Yuri didn't have the manpower for a frontal assault, but he had enough desperate men to attempt a targeted breach. Charmian curled into a tight ball, her hands clamped over her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut, inhaling the sudden, acrid smell of pulverized plaster and cordite. Footsteps crunched on the broken glass. Heavy boots, 2 sets. "Clear the kitchen," a gruff voice barked in Russian. "Check the pantry." Charmian stopped breathing. She pressed her back flat against the cold base of the cabinets, her heart hammering so violently it felt like it would tear through her ribs. She was unarmed. She was entirely exposed if they walked around the island. The crunch of boots drew closer. A shadow fell across the polished tile floor near her feet. Then a sickening, wet thud echoed over the blaring alarm. The shadow dropped abruptly. A heavy body hit the floor, a gurgling, wet sound spilling from its throat. The second intruder spun around, raising his rifle. He never got a shot off. Vincent moved from the hallway darkness like a localized weather event. He didn't use his gun. It was too tight, too chaotic. He drove a combat knife upward, sliding it flawlessly under the tactical vest and into the man's ribcage. Vincent's momentum carried them both backward, slamming the Russian into the stainless steel refrigerator. The impact rattled the appliances. Vincent twisted the blade with brutal mechanical efficiency, pulled it free, and let the corpse slide to the floor. The kitchen fell deathly silent, save for the blaring alarms and the hiss of a ruptured water pipe. Vincent stood over the bodies. His white dress shirt was ruined, splattered in a violent arc of crimson. He breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling in sharp, controlled increments. He didn't wipe the blade. He just turned, his dark eyes scanning the wreckage until they locked onto the space behind the island. "Charmian!" he barked. She flinched, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. She couldn't speak. She was looking at the pool of blood expanding rapidly across the white tile, creeping toward the tip of her sneaker. Vincent crossed the room in 2 strides. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the glass biting into his slacks. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip iron tight, forcing her to look at him instead of the carnage. "Look at me," he commanded. Her eyes darted wildly, terrified before finally snapping to his face. "Are you hit?" he asked. His voice wasn't warm. It was rough, demanding, operating entirely on adrenaline and violent necessity. She shook her head, a jerky, frantic motion. Vincent let out a long, hard exhale, the tension in his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. Without another word, he slid his arms under her knees and behind her back, lifting her effortlessly off the floor. Charmian gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his neck as he stood up. He smelled like gunpowder, expensive cologne, and copper. He didn't put her down. He carried her out of the kitchen, his boots stepping cleanly over the bodies of the men who had come to kill him. He navigated the darkened hallways of the West Wing with practiced ease, moving toward the reinforced safe room in the sub-basement. "I can walk," she whispered, her voice trembling against his collar. "You're in shock," Vincent replied flatly, kicking a heavy steel door open. "You'll trip. I don't have time to pick you up twice." He carried her down the concrete steps, the heavy steel door sealing behind them with a definitive hydraulic hiss, cutting off the shriek of the alarms. The safe room was stark, lit by emergency halogens. He set her down gently on a leather cot in the corner, finally stepping back to give her space. He turned away, pulling a burner phone from his pocket, dialing Alejandro. Charmian watched him. His hands were covered in blood. His shirt was ruined. He had just butchered two men in front of her without hesitation. He was the monster everyone whispered about on the streets. But as she sat shivering in the cold, sterile light of the bunker, Charmian realized something that terrified her more than the gunfire. She wasn't afraid of him. When the glass shattered, she hadn't wished for the police. She hadn't wished for her brother. She had wished for the devil standing in front of her. Dawn broke over the Costa estate, painting the heavy grey clouds in pale, bruised shades of violet and orange. The house smelled strongly of industrial bleach. The bodies were gone. The shattered glass had been swept up. The Costa Syndicate operated like a well-oiled machine, cleaning its messes with terrifying speed. Alejandro White walked into Vincent's study, looking utterly exhausted. His suit was wrinkled, his tie missing. "It's done," Alejandro said, sinking into one of the leather wingback chairs. "Yuri is dead. Heart attack in his sleep, courtesy of a syringe full of potassium chloride. The remaining Petrov lieutenants have already called to pledge loyalty. The war is over before it started." Vincent stood by the window, staring out at the perimeter wall. He had changed into a clean black sweater and dark jeans, but he still looked wired, his jaw tight, his posture rigid. "And the estate?" Vincent asked, not turning around. "Secured. The perimeter guards who fell asleep at their posts have been terminated from employment," Alejandro replied carefully. He rubbed his temples. "Vince, you can't keep her here. The girl." Vincent finally turned around. His eyes were cold, dangerous pits. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Alejandro said, holding his ground. "She's a civilian. She's a liability. You paid her brother's debt because you didn't like a mess in your house. I get it. But last night, they breached the compound. They almost killed her. If you keep her close, someone will eventually use her to get to you. It's the nature of our business. You know this." Vincent stared at his underboss for a long, heavy minute. The silence stretched until it felt fragile enough to snap. "Have a bag packed with 200,000 in untraceable cash," Vincent finally said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Get her a new passport, a new social. Set up a car to take her out of state by noon." Alejandro nodded slowly, relieved. "I'll handle it." An hour later, Charmian sat perfectly still in the leather chair opposite Vincent's desk. The bruising on her face was long gone, but she looked paler than ever. On the desk between them sat a heavy black duffel bag and a pristine manila envelope. "There's $200,000 in the bag," Vincent said, leaning back in his chair. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the heavy brass pen sitting on his blotter. "The envelope contains a clean identity. New name, new background. The car out front will take you to an airfield. You'll be in Oregon by tonight. You can finish your degree. You never have to scrub another pan or look over your shoulder again." Charmian stared at the money. It was more wealth than she could conceptualize. It was freedom. It was absolute, undeniable safety. Why? She asked quietly. Because my world is a meat grinder, Vincent replied, finally looking up. The coldness in his eyes was absolute, a steel wall meant to shut her out. You survived the Petrovs. You barely survived last night. The next time someone comes for my throat, they will aim at whatever is standing next to me. I don't want your blood on my hands. Take the money. Leave. Charmian didn't move. She thought of her brother, selling her out to save his own skin. She thought of the cold, indifferent world outside these walls, a world that had chewed her up and spit her out since the day she aged out of foster care. Then she thought of the man sitting in front of her, a man who shattered bones to protect a maid, a man who carried her out of a blood-soaked kitchen because he wouldn't let her walk through the gore. He was telling her she was a liability, but he had put his body between her and the bullets. Charmian reached forward. She didn't grab the bag. She placed her small, scarred hand squarely on top of the black canvas and pushed it back across the desk toward him. Vincent frowned, his composure cracking slightly. "What are you doing?" "I'm not leaving," Charmian said. "You don't have a choice," Vincent snapped, his voice rising, shedding the cold detachment. "This isn't a negotiation, Charmian. You are going to take the money, and you are going to walk out that door before I have my men carry you out." "Like you carried me last night," she countered, her voice eerily calm, refusing to back down. Vincent stood up, slamming his hands flat on the desk. "You don't understand what this life is. You think because I saved you, I'm a good man. I ordered a man dead while you were sleeping in my bunker. I am a plague. I will destroy you." Charmian stood up slowly, matching his stance. She looked directly into his eyes, unafraid of the violence swirling in them. "I lived in the real world, Vincent," she said, using his first name for the very first time. It felt heavy in the air between them. "The real world let me starve. The real world let men like Anton Petrov beat me while everyone looked the other way. The real world is a rigged game." She stepped around the heavy desk, closing the distance between them. Vincent didn't move away. He couldn't. "You said it yourself," Charmian continued softly, looking up at him. "You don't play a game where the other guy's holding the hammer. You find a different game." Vincent stared down at her, his chest rising and falling heavily. He could see the absolute conviction in her brown eyes. She wasn't the terrified girl scrubbing dishes at 3 in the morning anymore. She had walked through the fire of his world and decided she liked the warmth. "If you stay," Vincent warned, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper, leaning in until he could smell the faint scent of her green tea. "You don't get to leave. Ever. You become mine, in every sense of the word, and I don't share what belongs to me." "I know," Charmian whispered back, stepping into his space, fully surrendering to the cage of steel, knowing it was the only place she was truly untouchable. "So cancel the car." Vincent reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing over the spot where her bruise used to be. For the first time in his life, the undisputed king of the city realized he was entirely at someone else's mercy. If you felt the intense, dark pull of Vincent and Charmian's story, don't just scroll past. Hit that like button to let us know you want more gritty, deeply emotional mafia romances that actually show the psychological stakes. Share this video with your friends who love a slow-burn romance where the villain falls first and falls hard. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming original audio stories. Drop a comment below telling us what you think Charmian's first move as the boss's equal should be. See you next time.